Hi, I'm Maegan Young, and my sister Jessica convinced my parole officer that I violated the terms of my house arrest. She told him I'd been sneaking out at night, meeting with old associates, planning something dangerous. She painted me as a repeat offender who couldn't be trusted, someone who would throw away her second chance without a second thought. The irony? My ankle monitor recorded every single step I took for 6 months straight, and the data proved I never left my duplex on Maple Street. Not once. Not even to check the mail. But that wasn't the real betrayal. The real betrayal was discovering why she wanted me back behind bars so desperately, and how far she was willing to go to make it happen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me start from the beginning. 3 years ago, I was sentenced to 18 months for embezzlement from Morrison Financial Group, where I worked as a junior accountant. The conviction came with 5 years of probation and 6 months of house arrest with electronic monitoring. I maintained my innocence throughout the trial, but the evidence seemed ironclad. Bank records showed unauthorized transfers from client accounts to an offshore account linked to my Social Security number. Security footage allegedly showed me staying late in the office on the nights the transfers occurred. My defense attorney, a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, barely put up a fight. Jessica attended every court hearing, sitting in the front row with tissues in her hand and concern etched across her face. She held my hand during the sentencing and promised she'd help me rebuild my life when I got out. She was pursuing her MBA at Arizona State University then, specializing in business administration and finance. Everyone always said Jessica was the smart one, the successful one, the daughter who would make our parents proud. I was the screw-up who somehow got caught up in something I couldn't handle. My duplex on Maple Street was barely 800 square feet, split between a cramped living area and a single bedroom that smelled like the previous tenant's cigarettes no matter how much air freshener I used. The ankle monitor felt heavier than it actually was, a constant reminder that I was being watched, tracked, monitored like a dangerous animal. Officer Rodriguez explained the rules during our first meeting. Stay within the designated perimeter. No alcohol. No contact with known felons. Report any changes in employment, residence, or relationship status. Maintain a landline for monitoring. Calls. The list went on. The electronic monitoring device was about the size of a deck of cards, strapped to my left ankle with a tamper-proof band. It communicated with a base unit plugged into my living room wall, which connected to the monitoring center through my phone line. If I moved more than 50 feet from the base unit, alarms would trigger. If I tried to remove or damage the device, alarms would trigger. If the signal was blocked or interrupted for more than a few minutes, alarms would trigger. The technology was impressive in its thoroughness and utterly depressing in its implications. Those first few weeks of house arrest were the longest of my life. I woke up every morning in the same small bedroom, looked out the same window at Mrs. Patterson's garden next door, and tried to figure out how to fill 16 waking hours without going insane. I couldn't work because my conviction made me unemployable in any financial capacity. I couldn't drive because my license had been suspended. I couldn't even take a walk around the block to clear my head. The 4 walls of that duplex became my entire universe. Jessica visited twice a week during those early months, usually on Tuesday evenings and Sunday afternoons. She'd bring groceries from the expensive organic market in Scottsdale, magazines she thought I might like, and updates about her graduate program. She was writing her thesis on corporate fraud prevention, which felt like salt in an open wound, but I appreciated the company. She'd sit on my secondhand couch, careful not to wrinkle her designer clothes, and tell me about her classes, her professors, her new boyfriend Tyler, who worked at some investment firm downtown. The conversations always felt slightly off, like she was performing kindness rather than feeling it. She'd ask about my daily routine with the sort of clinical interest a researcher might show in a lab rat. What time did I wake up? How did I spend my afternoons? Was I sleeping well? Had I been in contact with anyone from my old job? Her questions seemed innocent enough, but something about the way she asked them made me uncomfortable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There was an intensity behind her eyes that didn't match her concerned sister act. Marcus lived in the other half of my duplex, separated by a thin wall that let me hear his television and the occasional phone conversation. He was in his 50s, recently divorced, working construction when his back allowed it. He knew about my situation because my parole officer had interviewed him as part of the background check for my housing arrangement. Most people would have requested a different neighbor, but Marcus seemed unfazed by my criminal record. He even offered to help with groceries and maintenance issues since I couldn't leave the property. We developed an odd but comfortable friendship through our shared wall and occasional conversations on the front steps. Marcus had his own legal troubles in the past, nothing serious, but enough to understand how the system could chew people up and spit them out. He never asked about my case or offered unsolicited advice about rehabilitation. He just treated me like a normal person, which was more valuable than he probably realized. One evening in my 4th month of house arrest, Marcus knocked on my door holding a plate of leftover spaghetti and a concerned expression. He'd been working in his backyard that afternoon and noticed a woman taking pictures of my duplex from the street. She had a nice camera with a long lens and spent about 20 minutes photographing different angles of the building, paying particular attention to the windows and entrance. When Marcus walked over to ask if she needed help, she claimed to be a real estate photographer working on a market analysis for the neighborhood. Something about her story didn't sit right with him. I looked out my front window and saw tire tracks in the gravel where someone had parked for an extended period. The positioning was perfect for surveillance of my duplex. My stomach knotted as I realized someone had been watching me, documenting my living situation for reasons I couldn't understand. I called Officer Rodriguez to report the incident, but he seemed more interested in whether I had recognized the photographer than in investigating potential harassment of his parolee. Jessica's visits became more frequent after that incident, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. She'd arrive unannounced, using the spare key I'd given her for emergencies, and let herself in like she owned the place. Her questions became more specific and probing. Had I been following all the rules? Was the ankle monitor working properly? Had I experienced any technical glitches or signal interruptions? She seemed particularly interested in the base unit, examining it closely, and asking detailed questions about how the monitoring system operated. The shift in her behavior was subtle but unmistakable. She'd position herself where she could see the ankle monitor while we talked, watching for any signs that it might be malfunctioning. She'd ask to use my bathroom and then take longer than necessary, moving through my small duplex like she was conducting an inspection. When I questioned her about it, she laughed and claimed she was just worried about me, making sure I was taking care of myself and staying out of trouble. Tyler started accompanying her on some visits, which struck me as strange since they'd never expressed interest in meeting me before. He was tall and impeccably dressed, with the kind of confident smile that successful people wore like armor. He worked for Pinnacle Investment Partners, Jessica explained, specializing in asset recovery and financial restructuring. He'd shake my hand firmly and make small talk about the weather or current events, but his eyes were always moving, cataloging details about my living situation and daily routine. During one particularly uncomfortable visit, Tyler mentioned that Pinnacle had contracts with several local law enforcement agencies to provide financial consulting services. They helped track down hidden assets in criminal cases, he explained, using advanced computer modeling and data analysis. It was fascinating work, he said, connecting the dots between seemingly unrelated financial transactions to build comprehensive pictures of criminal enterprises. The way he looked at me while describing his job felt like a threat disguised as conversation. I started paying closer attention to the ankle monitor's behavior after Jessica's questions became so persistent. The device emitted a soft beep every hour to confirm signal connectivity, and the base unit had a series of LED lights that indicated system status. Green meant normal operation, yellow indicated minor connectivity issues, and red meant serious, problems requiring immediate attention. In 5 months of wearing the device, I'd never seen anything but steady green lights and regular hourly beeps. Officer Rodriguez conducted mandatory home visits twice a month, always announced in advance, and always professional but cold. He'd check the ankle monitor, inspect the base unit, and ask standard questions about my compliance with parole conditions. He seemed satisfied with my progress and never indicated any concerns about my behavior or the monitoring system's performance. His reports consistently noted that I was a model parolee who posed minimal risk of reoffending. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday morning in early October. I was drinking coffee and reading a library book when my phone rang at exactly 9:15. Officer Rodriguez's voice was stern and formal, nothing like his usual, businesslike but neutral tone. He informed me that he'd received a credible report that I'd been violating the terms of my house arrest by leaving the property during overnight hours. The violations had allegedly occurred on 3 separate occasions over the previous 2 weeks. My blood turned to ice water. I explained that I hadn't left the duplex even once since my house arrest began, that the ankle monitor would have recorded any movement beyond the approved perimeter. Officer Rodriguez cut me off, saying that the reporting party had provided detailed information about my alleged nighttime activities, including specific times and locations where I'd been observed. He was scheduling an emergency hearing with my parole officer supervisor and a representative from the monitoring company for the following morning. I hung up the phone and immediately called the monitoring company's technical support line. The customer service representative confirmed that my device had been functioning normally throughout the entire monitoring period. No perimeter violations had been recorded. No tamper alerts had been triggered. No signal interruptions had occurred. The GPS tracking data showed continuous presence at my registered address for 153 consecutive days. They agreed to provide a comprehensive data report for the hearing. That afternoon, I called Jessica to tell her about the accusations and ask if she had any idea who might have reported false information about my activities. Her reaction was strange and telling. Instead of expressing shock or outrage on my behalf, she sounded nervous and evasive. She asked detailed questions about what Officer Rodriguez had said, what evidence was being presented, and what consequences I might face if the allegations were proven true. When I mentioned the monitoring company's data report, she went quiet for a long moment before quickly ending the call. Marcus was working in his garden when I went outside to clear my head. I told him about the accusations and my upcoming hearing, and his face darkened with anger. He'd been home every night for the past 2 weeks, he said, and he would have heard if I'd left the duplex during overnight hours. The walls were thin enough that he could hear my television and footsteps during normal evening activities. He offered to provide a statement confirming that he'd never observed any suspicious late-night departures from my side of the building. That evening, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Jessica's phone calls and visits over the previous months, analyzing her questions and behavior with new suspicion. Her interest in the ankle monitor suddenly seemed less like concern and more like reconnaissance. Her probing questions about my daily routine and compliance with parole conditions took on a sinister cast. The photographer Marcus had observed, the increased frequency of her visits, Tyler's pointed comments about his work in asset recovery, it all started forming a pattern that made my stomach turn. I spent the night reviewing every interaction I'd had with Jessica since my house arrest began, looking for clues I'd missed or explanations for her strange behavior. I remembered her thesis topic, corporate fraud prevention, and wondered if she was using my case as research material. I thought about Tyler's work with law enforcement agencies and his obvious interest in my living situation. Most troubling of all I realized that Jessica was the only person outside of my legal team and parole officer who knew the specific details of my monitoring conditions and daily schedule. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock Friday morning at the probation office downtown. I dressed in the most professional clothes I owned, a navy blue dress I'd bought for court appearances 3 years earlier, and tried to prepare myself for whatever accusations would be leveled against me. Marcus drove me to the hearing, since I still couldn't drive myself, and promised to wait in the parking lot until everything was resolved. The conference room was sterile and intimidating, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick. Officer Rodriguez sat at one end of a long table with his supervisor, a stern woman named Captain Martinez, who'd been overseeing parole cases for 15 years. A technical representative from the monitoring company, a nervous young man with CT, thick glasses and a tablet computer, sat across from them reviewing data reports. My public defender, the same overworked attorney who'd handled my original case, arrived 5 minutes late with coffee stains on his shirt and an apologetic expression. Captain Martinez began the hearing by reading the formal allegations against me. I had allegedly been observed leaving my residence on October 2nd at approximately 11:30 p.m., returning at 1:15 a.m. I had allegedly been seen at a 24-hour diner on Central Avenue at midnight on October 5th, meeting with an unidentified male companion. I had allegedly been spotted in the parking lot of a storage facility on October 9th at 2 a.m., loading items into a vehicle with out-of-state license plates. Each allegation was specific and detailed, exactly the kind of evidence that would convince a parole board to revoke my house arrest and send me back to prison. Officer Rodriguez explained that the reporting party was a concerned citizen who'd recognized me from local news coverage of my case and felt obligated to report my apparent parole violations. The reports had been corroborated by a second witness who claimed to have observed similar suspicious activities. Both witnesses were willing to testify under oath about what they'd seen, and their statements had been deemed credible enough to warrant immediate investigation. My public defender asked to review the monitoring company's data before responding to the allegations. The technical representative pulled up my tracking history on his tablet and confirmed what I already knew. No perimeter violations had been recorded during the time periods in question. The GPS data showed continuous presence at my registered address, with location accuracy verified by satellite positioning and cellular tower triangulation. The ankle monitor had performed exactly as designed, providing real-time location tracking with no gaps or anomalies. Captain Martinez frowned as she compared the witness statements with the electronic monitoring data. The discrepancy was obvious and significant. Either the witnesses were mistaken or lying, or the monitoring system had somehow failed to detect my alleged movements. She asked the technical representative about the possibility of device malfunction or tampering, but he assured her that such scenarios would have triggered automatic alerts and been immediately reported to the probation office. Officer Rodriguez looked uncomfortable as he realized that his investigation was falling apart. He'd accepted the witness reports at face value, without considering the contradiction with the electronic evidence. His notes indicated that he hadn't independently verified the allegations or interviewed any additional witnesses who might have contradicted the claims. He'd simply assumed that 2 corroborating reports constituted sufficient evidence to justify a parole violation hearing. My public defender seized on the monitoring data as definitive proof of my innocence. Electronic monitoring systems were specifically designed to prevent the kind of violations I was accused of committing, he argued. The GPS tracking was accurate to within a few feet, and the continuous data stream showed no gaps or interruptions that would indicate system malfunction. If I had actually left my residence during the alleged time periods, the monitoring system would have immediately detected and reported those movements. Captain Martinez asked Officer Rodriguez to identify the witnesses who'd made the reports against me. He consulted his notes and provided 2 names I didn't recognize, along with brief descriptions of their alleged observations. The first witness was described as a middle-aged woman who lived in my neighborhood and regularly walked her dog during late evening hours. The second witness was identified as a security guard who worked night shifts at various locations around the city and claimed to have encountered me on multiple occasions. Something about those descriptions triggered a memory that made my blood run cold. Jessica had mentioned a new friend from her graduate program, someone who lived near my duplex and had expressed interest in criminal justice issues. She'd also talked about Tyler's connections in the security industry and his work with asset recovery investigations. The timing of these alleged sightings corresponded exactly with the period when Jessica's visits had become more frequent and her questions more invasive. I asked Captain Martinez if I could see the written statements provided by the witnesses. She hesitated, citing confidentiality concerns, but my public defender insisted that I had a right to review any evidence being used against me. The witness statements were detailed and convincing, describing my appearance, clothing, and behavior with remarkable specificity. But as I read them, I noticed something that confirmed my worst suspicions about who was really behind these false accusations. Both witnesses described me wearing a distinctive red jacket that I'd never owned. They mentioned a small tattoo on my left wrist that didn't exist. They claimed I'd been driving a silver sedan, even though I didn't have a valid driver's license or access to a vehicle. Most telling of all, they described me as being accompanied by a tall man with dark hair and an expensive watch, someone who sounded remarkably similar to Tyler Brooks. The witnesses weren't describing me at all. They were describing someone who was deliberately impersonating me. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been systematically impersonating me, creating a false trail of evidence designed to send me back to prison. But why would anyone go to such elaborate lengths to destroy my freedom? I raised my hand during the hearing and asked Captain Martinez if I could speak privately with my attorney before the proceedings continued. She granted a 15-minute recess, and we stepped into a cramped consultation room that smelled like stale coffee and desperation. I explained my suspicions about Jessica and Tyler to my public defender, whose tired eyes suddenly sharpened with interest. He'd handled hundreds of parole cases over the years, but he'd never encountered such a sophisticated frame-up attempt. The use of imposters to create false witness testimony was something he'd only seen in high-stakes criminal cases involving organized crime or corporate espionage. The level of planning and coordination required suggested that someone with significant resources and connections was targeting me specifically. When we returned to the conference room, my attorney requested permission to cross-examine the witnesses who'd made the allegations against me. Captain Martinez agreed, but Officer Rodriguez informed us that both witnesses had insisted on anonymity due to safety concerns. They were afraid of retaliation from me or my associates, he explained, and had only agreed to provide statements under guarantee of confidentiality. This convenient arrangement made it impossible for us to challenge their credibility or expose the inconsistencies in their testimony. My attorney pointed out that anonymous accusations violated basic principles of due process and fairness. I had a constitutional right to confront my accusers and challenge the evidence against me. The monitoring data provided objective, scientific proof that I hadn't violated my parole conditions, while the witness statements contained obvious factual errors that suggested deliberate deception. He demanded that the allegations be dismissed immediately or that the witnesses be required to testify under oath in open proceedings. Captain Martinez looked increasingly uncomfortable as the legal complications mounted. She'd expected a straightforward parole violation case, not a complex investigation involving potential perjury and identity fraud. She announced that the hearing would be postponed, pending further investigation by the probation department's Internal Affairs Unit. I would remain on house arrest under my current conditions while they sorted through the conflicting evidence and determined what had actually happened. The drive home with Marcus was tense and quiet. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets of my neighborhood, wondering how many other people were watching me and reporting my movements to unknown authorities. The paranoia was creeping in despite my logical understanding that the electronic monitoring data proved my innocence. Someone had invested considerable time and effort into destroying my life, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of their campaign against me. Marcus helped me back into my duplex and checked the locks on all the windows and doors. He'd installed a security camera above his front entrance a few months earlier, he mentioned, and the angle might have captured activity around my side of the building. We spent the afternoon reviewing the footage from the previous 2 weeks, looking for evidence of surveillance or suspicious visitors. The video quality wasn't perfect, but it clearly showed me entering and leaving my duplex only for approved activities like meeting with my parole officer or accepting grocery deliveries. That evening, I decided to confront Jessica directly about my suspicions. I called her cell phone and asked if she could come over for an emergency family meeting. Something serious had happened, I explained, and I needed her support and advice. She agreed to visit that night, but her voice sounded strained and artificial, like she was reading from a script. I spent the time before her arrival preparing mentally for what might be the most important conversation of my life. Jessica arrived at 7:30 wearing a black business suit that made her look older and more severe than usual. Tyler accompanied her again, which I hadn't expected but probably should have anticipated. They sat across from me in my small living room, and I noticed how their eyes immediately went to the ankle monitor and base unit. Their behavior was different tonight, more formal and guarded, like they were attending a business meeting rather than visiting family. I started by explaining what had happened at the hearing, describing the false accusations and the contradictory evidence in careful detail. Jessica listened with appropriate expressions of shock and concern, but I caught her exchanging meaningful glances with Tyler when she thought I wasn't looking. When I mentioned the specific details provided by the anonymous witnesses, including the red jacket and non-existent tattoo, Jessica's face went pale for just a moment before she recovered her composure. Tyler leaned forward and asked probing questions about the monitoring system and the data it had collected. He seemed particularly interested in the technical aspects of GPS tracking and whether the system could be fooled or manipulated by sophisticated criminals. His questions revealed a detailed understanding of electronic monitoring technology that seemed unusual for someone who supposedly worked in investment finance. I began to suspect that his real expertise lay in areas he hadn't disclosed. I decided to test my theory by mentioning a few fabricated details about my case and monitoring conditions. I claimed that the ankle monitor had been malfunctioning recently, causing false alarms and connectivity issues. I said that Officer Rodriguez had expressed concerns about the reliability of the GPS data and was considering upgrading me to a more advanced monitoring system. Jessica and Tyler both reacted with visible interest to these invented problems, asking follow-up questions that revealed their intimate knowledge of electronic monitoring procedures. The conversation continued for another hour, but the undercurrent of tension was becoming harder to ignore. Jessica kept steering the discussion toward my daily routine and future plans, while Tyler focused on the legal implications of the false accusations. They seemed less interested in providing emotional support than in gathering intelligence about my situation and the investigation process. When they finally left, I felt more isolated and vulnerable than ever. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to my door. A woman in her 40s wearing a rumpled blazer and carrying a battered briefcase introduced herself as Detective Sarah Chen from the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. She was investigating irregularities in several recent embezzlement cases, she explained, and had some questions about my conviction and the evidence that had been used against me. She showed me her badge and asked if we could speak privately about my case. Detective Chen's approach was different from any law enforcement officer I'd encountered during my original prosecution. She seemed genuinely interested in my perspective and took detailed notes as I described the evidence that had led to my conviction. She asked specifically about the offshore bank account that had been linked to my Social Security number and whether I'd ever had any business relationships or financial dealings outside the United States. Her questions suggested that she suspected something irregular about the financial evidence in my case. I explained that I'd never opened any international accounts or conducted business outside the country. The offshore account that had been central to my conviction was completely unknown to me until it was presented during the trial. My defense attorney had barely investigated its origins, accepting the prosecution's explanation that I'd opened it using false documentation. Detective Chen made additional notes and asked if I'd be willing to provide fingerprint and handwriting samples to compare with the account opening materials. She also asked about my family relationships and whether anyone close to me had detailed knowledge of my employment at Morrison Financial Group. I told her about Jessica's frequent visits and questions about my case, as well as her thesis research on corporate fraud prevention. Detective Chen's expression grew more serious as I described Tyler's work with asset recovery and his apparent expertise in financial investigation techniques. She asked for their full names and contact information, claiming it was routine background verification. Before leaving, Detective Chen mentioned that several other embezzlement cases from the past few years had involved similar patterns of evidence and similar offshore account structures. The financial institutions involved were all connected to a network of shell companies that had been created using stolen identity information. Someone with sophisticated knowledge of banking regulations and electronic fund transfers had been systematically framing innocent people for crimes they hadn't committed. My case appeared to fit the pattern perfectly. The implications of Detective Chen's investigation hit me like an avalanche. If she was right, then my conviction had been based on fabricated evidence created by someone with advanced financial expertise and access to personal identity information. The timing of her visit, combined with the recent false parole violation accusations, suggested that the same person or organization was still actively working to destroy my life. The web of deception was far more complex and dangerous than I'd originally imagined. That afternoon, I received a phone call from an unknown number with a local area code. The caller identified himself as attorney Marcus Rivera from the Innocence Project of Arizona, a nonprofit organization that worked to exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals. Detective Chen had contacted his office, he explained, and suggested that my case might warrant investigation by their team. He wanted to schedule a meeting to review the evidence from my original trial and discuss the possibility of appealing my conviction. Attorney Rivera's call filled me with hope for the first time in months. The Innocence Project had successfully overturned dozens of wrongful convictions in Arizona, using advanced forensic techniques and investigative resources that weren't available to most criminal defendants. If they agreed to take my case, I might finally have access to competent legal representation and the expertise needed to prove my innocence. I scheduled a meeting for the following week and began gathering all the documentation I could find from my original trial. Jessica called that evening, ostensibly to check on my emotional state after the parole hearing. Her tone was overly sympathetic, but her questions revealed a keen interest in my legal strategy and any new developments in my case. When I mentioned Detective Chen's visit and the Innocence Project consultation, Jessica went silent for several seconds before asking detailed questions about what information I'd shared with these investigators. Her concern seemed focused on protecting herself rather than supporting me. I decided to test Jessica's reaction by providing false information about my legal situation. I told her that Detective Chen had found definitive proof that someone had used my identity to open the offshore accounts, and that arrests were imminent. In the case, I claimed that the Innocence Project had already agreed to represent me and that they were planning to file an emergency appeal based on new evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. Jessica's responses revealed a level of detailed knowledge about legal procedures that seemed inconsistent with her supposed MBA studies. The conversation ended abruptly when Tyler could be heard in the background asking Jessica urgent questions about what I'd told her. She claimed that someone was at the door and hung up quickly, but not before I heard Tyler's voice rising in what sounded like panic or anger. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a clearer picture, and none of it reflected well on my sister or her boyfriend. I spent the rest of the evening reviewing every interaction I'd had with them, looking for additional clues about their true motives and activities. Marcus knocked on my door around 9 o'clock with a concerned expression and a manila envelope in his hand. He'd been checking his mailbox when he noticed a car parked across the street with 2 people inside who appeared to be conducting surveillance of our duplex. The vehicle had been there for over an hour, he explained, and the occupants were using what looked like professional photography equipment to document our building. He'd managed to photograph their license plate and take some pictures of the car before they drove away. The photographs Marcus had taken were blurry, but clear enough to make out a silver sedan with tinted windows and temporary dealer plates. The 2 occupants appeared to be a woman with dark hair and a tall man wearing a baseball cap, but their faces weren't visible in the images. The timing of the surveillance, coming immediately after my conversation with Jessica about Detective Chen and the Innocence Project, seemed like more than a coincidence. Someone was keeping very close tabs on my activities and the people who were trying to help me. I called Detective Chen's direct number and left a detailed voicemail about the surveillance incident and Marcus's photographs. I also mentioned Jessica's suspicious reactions to news about the investigation and her apparent detailed knowledge of legal procedures. Detective Chen returned my call within an hour, which surprised me given that it was nearly 10 o'clock on a Friday night. She asked me to email Marcus's photographs immediately and warned me to be extremely careful about sharing information regarding the investigation with anyone, including family members. The seriousness in Detective Chen's voice made my blood run cold. She explained that financial fraud rings often included family members or close associates who helped identify potential victims and gather the personal information needed to execute identity theft. The fact that Jessica had detailed knowledge of my employment, financial situation, and legal case made her a person of interest in the broader investigation. Detective Chen advised me to limit my contact with Jessica and to document any future interactions carefully. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in my narrow bed listening to every sound outside my duplex, wondering if someone was watching my windows or planning their next move against me. The ankle monitor felt heavier than usual, a constant reminder of how easily my freedom could be taken away by people who were willing to lie and fabricate evidence. I thought about my parents, who had died in a car accident when Jessica and I were teenagers, and wondered what they would think about the person their youngest daughter had become. The weekend passed slowly and quietly, with no visits from Jessica or Tyler and no obvious surveillance of my duplex. Marcus spent Saturday installing additional security lighting around our building and checking the locks on all our doors and windows. He'd served in the military years ago, he mentioned, and something about the recent activity around our home reminded him of the intelligence-gathering operations he'd observed overseas. Professional surveillance and systematic intimidation were serious business, he warned, and I needed to be prepared for the possibility that things might escalate further. Sunday evening brought another unexpected phone call, this time from Attorney Rivera's office. His paralegal explained that they'd conducted a preliminary review of my case files and found several irregularities that warranted immediate investigation. The offshore bank account that had been central to my conviction had been opened using documentation that contained subtle but significant discrepancies from my actual personal information. The signatures were close, but not perfect matches, and the address listed on the account opening forms was a mail forwarding service rather than my actual residence. More importantly, the paralegal continued, the electronic fund transfers that had supposedly originated from my computer at Morrison Financial Group had actually been initiated from an external network connection that couldn't be traced to my workstation. The prosecution had presented this evidence as proof that I'd used my office computer to execute the transfers. But the technical analysis showed that the transactions had been conducted remotely by someone with sophisticated hacking capabilities and detailed knowledge of the company's financial systems. The Innocence Project was prepared to take my case, Attorney Rivera's paralegal explained, but they needed me to sign confidentiality agreements and provide additional documentation about my family relationships and personal history. They were particularly interested in anyone who might have had access to my personal information or knowledge of my work responsibilities at Morrison Financial Group. The investigation would be comprehensive and might take several months to complete, but they were confident that they could prove my innocence and secure my exoneration. I agreed to all of their requirements and scheduled a meeting for Tuesday morning to sign the necessary paperwork and begin the formal investigation process. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like someone with real expertise and resources was taking my case seriously. The Innocence Project had a track record of success and a reputation for thorough, professional investigation. If anyone could untangle the web of deception that had destroyed my life, it would be them. Monday morning brought yet another surprise visitor to my door. Officer Rodriguez arrived unannounced for what he called a routine compliance check, but his demeanor was more formal and suspicious than usual. He spent longer than normal inspecting the ankle monitor and base unit, and he asked detailed questions about my recent activities and communications. When I mentioned Detective Chen's investigation and my upcoming meeting with the Innocence Project, his expression became noticeably more tense. Officer Rodriguez warned me about getting involved with outside investigators and legal organizations. That might interfere with my parole supervision. The probation department had procedures for handling complaints about wrongful conviction, he explained, and working with unauthorized third parties could be interpreted as failure to cooperate with supervision requirements. His warning felt more like intimidation than guidance, and I began to wonder whether someone had pressured him to discourage my pursuit of legal remedies. I asked Officer Rodriguez directly whether anyone had contacted him about my case or provided information about my activities beyond the standard monitoring reports. He hesitated before answering, which told me everything I needed to know. Someone with influence or authority had been feeding him information and shaping his perception of my case. The false parole violation allegations were just one part of a broader campaign to isolate me from potential allies and legal resources. After Officer Rodriguez left, I called Detective Chen to report the intimidation attempt and ask for advice about how to proceed. She listened carefully to my description of the conversation and asked specific questions about Officer Rodriguez's warnings and behavior. Her reaction suggested that this type of interference was not uncommon in complex fraud cases, particularly when the perpetrators had connections within law enforcement or the criminal justice system. She advised me to document all future interactions with my parole officer and to avoid discussing the investigation with anyone connected to my supervision. The meeting with Attorney Rivera on Tuesday morning took place in a modest office building, downtown, far removed from the sterile government facilities where I'd spent so much time over the previous 3 years. The Innocence Project's offices were cramped, but filled with boxes of case files and legal documents that represented hope for dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals. Attorney Rivera was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of intense focus that suggested he'd devoted his career to fighting injustice. We spent 2 hours reviewing the evidence from my original trial and discussing the preliminary findings of their investigation. Attorney Rivera explained that financial fraud cases often involved sophisticated criminal networks that operated for years before being detected. The perpetrators typically had advanced technical skills and inside knowledge of banking systems, corporate procedures, and legal processes. My case showed all the hallmarks of a professional operation that had targeted me specifically because of my position at Morrison Financial Group and my access to client account information. The offshore accounts that had been used to frame me were part of a larger network of shell companies and fake identities that had been created over several years. The Innocence Project's forensic accountants had traced connections between my case and at least 6 other embezzlement convictions in Arizona and neighboring states. All of the victims had been young women working in financial services, and all had been framed using similar techniques and evidence patterns. Someone had been systematically destroying innocent lives to cover their own criminal activities. Attorney Rivera asked detailed questions about Jessica and Tyler, particularly regarding their knowledge of my work at Morrison Financial Group and their access to my personal information. I described Jessica's thesis research on corporate fraud, prevention, and Tyler's alleged expertise in asset recovery, as well as their suspicious behavior during recent visits to my duplex. Attorney Rivera took extensive notes and asked for permission to conduct background investigations on both of them as part of the broader case analysis. Before I left the meeting, Attorney Rivera provided me with a secure cell phone and email account that would allow us to communicate without risk of interception or monitoring. The investigation was entering a sensitive phase, he explained, and it was crucial that information about our activities and findings be protected from anyone who might try to interfere with the process. He also arranged for a private security consultant to conduct periodic surveillance detection around my duplex and provide guidance on personal safety measures. The ride home with Marcus was quiet but hopeful. For the first time in years, I felt like I had competent legal representation and a realistic chance of proving my innocence. The Innocence Project's resources and expertise far exceeded anything I'd had access to during my original trial, and their track record of success gave me confidence that the truth would eventually emerge. I was still trapped in the ankle monitor and confined to my duplex, but the psychological prison of hopelessness was finally beginning to crack. That evening, I used the secure phone to call Detective Chen and update her on my meeting with the Innocence Project. She was pleased that I now had proper legal representation and promised to coordinate her investigation with Attorney Rivera's team. The Financial Crimes Unit had uncovered additional evidence connecting my case to a broader criminal network, she explained, and arrests were likely within the next few weeks. She cautioned me to be extremely careful about my safety and to report any suspicious activity immediately. Jessica called my regular phone number around 8 o'clock, but I let it go to voicemail rather than risk revealing information about the investigation. Her message was brief and seemingly concerned, asking about my well-being and requesting another family meeting to discuss my legal situation. The timing of her call, coming immediately after my meeting with the Innocence Project, reinforced my suspicion that someone was monitoring my activities and reporting back to her. I decided not to return her call until I'd had a chance to discuss the situation with Attorney Rivera. The next few days passed without incident, but I remained on high alert for any signs of surveillance or suspicious activity. Marcus had installed motion-activated security cameras around our duplex, and we took turns monitoring the feeds for unusual visitors or vehicles. The private security consultant provided by the Innocence Project conducted 2 drive-by assessments of our neighborhood and confirmed that professional surveillance was likely ongoing, though the operators were skilled enough to avoid easy detection. Attorney Rivera called on Friday afternoon with significant news about the investigation. The forensic analysis of the offshore bank accounts had revealed digital fingerprints, linking them to a specific computer network and set of technical tools. The Innocence Project's cybersecurity experts had traced the network to an investment firm called Pinnacle Asset Recovery, which matched the company where Tyler claimed to work. The connection was circumstantial, but strong enough to warrant further investigation and possible search warrants. More importantly, Attorney Rivera continued, Detective Chen's Financial Crimes Unit had identified several other victims of the fraud network who were willing to testify about their experiences. The pattern of targeting young women in financial services positions was consistent across all the cases, and the techniques used to frame them showed clear signs of inside knowledge and professional execution. The evidence was building toward a comprehensive case that would not only exonerate me, but also expose the entire criminal operation. I felt a mixture of relief and vindication as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. My conviction hadn't been the result of bad luck or poor legal representation, but rather a deliberate targeting by sophisticated criminals who had chosen me as a convenient scapegoat for their own activities. The knowledge that other innocent women had suffered similar fates was heartbreaking, but it also provided the strength of numbers needed to challenge such a well-organized criminal network. The weekend brought an escalation in the campaign against me that caught everyone off guard. Saturday morning, I received a call from Captain Martinez informing me that additional witnesses had come forward with new allegations about my parole violations. These witnesses claim to have observed me conducting suspicious activities during daytime hours, when the electronic monitoring data would clearly show my presence at the duplex. The allegations were obviously false, but they demonstrated that my enemies were becoming more desperate and reckless in their attempts to destroy my credibility. Captain Martinez scheduled an emergency meeting for Monday morning to address the new allegations, but this time she seemed skeptical rather than concerned. The latest witnesses claimed to have seen me meeting with suspicious individuals in broad daylight, conducting what appeared to be drug transactions in full view of neighbors and passing traffic. The scenarios described in their statements were so implausible that even Officer Rodriguez looked uncomfortable as he read them aloud during our phone conversation. I immediately contacted Attorney Rivera using the secure phone to report this escalation. His response was swift and decisive. The Innocence Project would file an emergency motion with the Superior Court challenging the continued house arrest and demanding an independent investigation of the false allegations. The pattern of increasingly desperate accusations suggested that someone was running out of time and options, possibly because they knew law enforcement was closing in on their operation. Detective Chen arrived at my duplex Sunday evening with a team of technical specialists from the police department's cybercrime unit. They needed to examine my personal computer and electronic devices to eliminate them as possible sources of the fraudulent offshore transactions, she explained. The examination would also help establish a timeline of my actual activities and communications that could be used to counter any future false allegations. I gladly provided access to everything they requested, knowing that my digital footprint would only support my innocence. The technical examination revealed something unexpected and deeply troubling. My home computer had been remotely accessed multiple times over the previous 6 months, with someone using sophisticated hacking tools to monitor my communications and steal personal information. The intrusions had been carefully designed to avoid detection, but the cybercrime specialists were able to recover digital evidence of the unauthorized access. The timestamps of the intrusions corresponded exactly with Jessica's visits to my duplex. Detective Chen explained that the remote access software found on my computer was the same type used by professional investigators and corporate security firms. Someone with advanced technical skills had been systematically monitoring my electronic communications, including emails, internet searches, and even my conversations with legal representatives. The invasion of privacy was comprehensive and ongoing, providing my enemies with real-time intelligence about my activities and plans. The discovery of the computer intrusions fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. What had appeared to be a case of financial fraud and false accusations was actually a sophisticated surveillance and harassment campaign designed to prevent me from clearing my name. The perpetrators had been staying one step ahead of my legal efforts because they knew exactly what strategies I was pursuing and what evidence I was gathering. The playing field had been tilted against me from the beginning. Marcus was working in his garden when the police technical team finished their examination and left my duplex. I told him about the computer hacking and asked if he'd noticed anything suspicious about Jessica's visits that might explain how she'd gained access to my electronic devices. He thought for a moment before mentioning that she'd always asked to use my bathroom during her visits, often staying longer than necessary and sometimes emerging with her purse or phone in hand rather than where she'd left them. The bathroom in my small duplex was adjacent to the corner where I kept my computer desk and wireless router. Someone familiar with hacking techniques could easily install monitoring software or access my wireless network from that location without being observed. Jessica's consistent requests to use the facilities, combined with her detailed questions about my computer usage and internet activities, suddenly made perfect sense. She'd been systematically compromising my digital security during every supposedly supportive family visit. I called Attorney Rivera to report the new developments and discuss how the computer intrusions affected our legal strategy. He was outraged by the scope of the surveillance, but also encouraged by the digital evidence we now possessed. The hacking activities constituted multiple federal crimes, including wire fraud, computer intrusion, and obstruction of justice. The Innocence Project would coordinate with federal prosecutors to ensure that all aspects of the criminal conspiracy were properly investigated and prosecuted. The emergency court hearing on Monday morning took place in a packed courtroom with representatives from multiple law enforcement agencies in attendance. Attorney Rivera presented the digital evidence of the computer intrusions, along with the contradictory electronic monitoring data that disproved all the parole violation allegations. Judge Thompson, a veteran jurist with a reputation for fairness and thorough analysis, listened carefully to both sides before making his ruling. Judge Thompson was clearly disturbed by the evidence of systematic harassment and surveillance. The false allegations against me showed a pattern of escalating desperation that suggested the accusers were attempting to prevent legitimate legal proceedings from moving forward. Combined with the digital evidence of computer hacking and identity theft, the case presented a clear picture of criminal conspiracy designed to obstruct justice and maintain a wrongful conviction. The judge granted the Innocence Project's motion for an independent investigation and suspended all parole violation proceedings pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. More importantly, he ordered the immediate removal of my ankle, monitor and lifted all house arrest restrictions, finding that the electronic monitoring data had conclusively proven my compliance with all parole conditions. For the first time in 6 months, I would be free to leave my duplex and move about the community without restrictions. The feeling of having the ankle monitor removed was indescribable. The device had become such a constant part of my daily existence that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to walk without its weight and bulk. The technician who removed it commented that the GPS tracking data showed I'd never moved more than 30 feet from the base unit during the entire monitoring, making me one of the most compliant parolees in the system's history. The irony was bitter, but the freedom was sweet. Detective Chen was waiting in the courthouse parking lot when I emerged from the hearing. She had significant news about the broader investigation that couldn't wait for a more private setting. Federal agents had executed search warrants at Pinnacle, asset recovery early that morning, seizing computers, financial records, and other evidence related to the fraud network. Tyler Brooks had been arrested at his apartment on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit computer crimes. The search of Pinnacle Asset Recovery had revealed a sophisticated criminal operation that went far beyond simple embezzlement. The company had been systematically targeting employees of financial services firms, using inside information to identify potential victims and then framing them for crimes that Pinnacle's operatives had actually committed. The stolen funds were laundered through complex networks of offshore accounts before being integrated into legitimate investment portfolios managed by the firm. Tyler's arrest had apparently triggered a panic response from his co-conspirators. Jessica had been observed at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport early that morning, attempting to board a flight to the Cayman Islands using a fake passport. Federal agents had intercepted her before she could leave the country, and she was now in custody facing charges related to the fraud conspiracy. The carefully constructed facade of graduate student and concerned sister had finally collapsed under the weight of evidence. Detective Chen drove me to the federal building downtown, where I would need to provide formal testimony about Jessica and Tyler's activities. The building was imposing and sterile, filled with serious people conducting serious business that would determine the fates of the criminals who had destroyed so many innocent lives. I felt nervous but also vindicated as I prepared to tell my story to investigators who finally understood the scope of what had been done to me. The federal agents who interviewed me were professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about every aspect of my relationship with Jessica and Tyler. They were particularly interested in the timeline of Jessica's visits to my duplex and her access to my personal information and computer systems. The evidence I provided would be crucial to establishing the conspiracy charges and proving that the fraud network had specifically targeted me because of my position at Morrison Financial Group. Special Agent Williams, who led the interview, explained that Jessica and Tyler were part of a larger criminal organization that had been operating for several years across multiple states. The group specialized in targeting young women working in financial services, using personal relationships and social engineering to gather the information needed to frame them for embezzlement. My case was particularly significant because it demonstrated the lengths to which the criminals would go to silence victims who threatened to expose their activities. The investigation had revealed that Jessica's graduate program in business administration was legitimate, but her thesis research on corporate fraud prevention had actually been a cover for learning advanced techniques for committing financial crimes. She'd used her access to university resources and academic databases to study real fraud cases and develop more sophisticated methods for framing innocent people. Her relationship with Tyler had begun as a criminal partnership rather than a romantic connection. More disturbing still was the discovery that Jessica had been systematically stealing my personal information since our teenage years, long before I'd ever worked in the financial services industry. She'd collected copies of my Social Security card, birth certificate, school records, and other identity documents over the years, creating a comprehensive file that would later be used to establish the fake offshore accounts. The betrayal went back much further than I'd ever imagined. The federal agents showed me copies of communications between Jessica and Tyler that had been recovered from their seized computers. The messages revealed a calculated plan to destroy my life and reputation in order to prevent me from investigating my wrongful conviction. They'd monitored my communications with attorneys and investigators, adjusting their strategy based on real-time intelligence about my legal efforts. The false parole violation allegations had been their desperate attempt to get me returned to prison before I could clear my name. One particularly chilling message from Jessica to Tyler described me as the loose end that could unravel everything, and discussed various options for permanently eliminating the threat I posed to their operation. The conversation included references to additional false accusations, potential violence, and even the possibility of having me killed in what would appear to be a random crime. Reading those words from my own sister was more devastating than any physical assault could have been. Agent Williams assured me that both Jessica and Tyler were now in federal custody without possibility of bail, charged with multiple felonies that carried potential sentences of several decades in prison. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and their cooperation with prosecutors would be essential to dismantling the entire fraud network and identifying all the victims who had been wrongfully convicted. My case would serve as a template for exonerating the other innocent women who had been framed by the organization. The interview concluded with Agent Williams asking if I needed any additional security measures while the investigation continued. Other members of the fraud network were still at large, and there was always a possibility that they might attempt to intimidate witnesses or interfere with the prosecution. I declined the offer of protective custody, but accepted a direct contact number for federal agents who could respond immediately if I felt threatened or observed suspicious activity. Marcus was waiting in the lobby of the federal building when I finished the interview, having driven there immediately after receiving my call. The relief on his face when he saw me walking freely without the ankle monitor was touching and genuine. He'd witnessed my struggles over the previous months and understood better than most people how much this day meant to me. We drove home, in comfortable silence, both of us processing the magnitude of what had been revealed about Jessica and Tyler. My duplex felt different when I walked through the door without the electronic monitoring equipment. The base unit that had dominated my living room for 6 months was gone, leaving only faded marks on the carpet and wall where it had been mounted. The absence of the constant green light and hourly beeps created a silence that felt strange and wonderful at the same time. I was finally free to leave whenever I wanted, go wherever I chose, and reclaim the basic human dignity that had been stripped away by false accusations. Attorney Rivera called that evening to congratulate me on the day's developments and discuss the next steps in my exoneration process. The Innocence Project would now file a formal petition to overturn my conviction based on the newly discovered evidence of fraud and conspiracy. The process would take several months to complete, but the outcome was virtually certain given the federal investigation and the cooperation of other victims. My criminal record would be expunged, and I would be eligible for compensation from the state's wrongful conviction fund. More importantly, Attorney Rivera continued, Morrison Financial Group had agreed to participate in the investigation and had discovered additional evidence that supported my innocence. The company's internal security review had revealed that their computer systems had been compromised by the same hackers who had framed me, with fraudulent transactions being conducted using stolen employee credentials. Morrison was prepared to issue a public statement acknowledging my innocence and offering me reinstatement to my former position with full back pay and benefits. The prospect of returning to normal employment and financial stability was almost overwhelming after years of isolation and poverty. I'd survived on disability payments and Marcus's occasional help with groceries, living in constant fear that any misstep could send me back to prison. The idea that I might soon be able to work, again earn a decent living and rebuild my life seemed almost too good to be true. I tried to contain my excitement while remaining focused on the ongoing legal proceedings. Detective Chen called later that evening with additional updates about the federal investigation. The search warrants executed that morning had yielded a treasure trove of evidence about the fraud network's operations, including detailed files on dozens of victims across multiple states. The organization had been operating for nearly a decade, systematically destroying innocent lives while generating millions of dollars in illegal profits. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than anyone had initially realized. Jessica's arrest had apparently caused a domino effect within the criminal organization, with several other operatives attempting to flee the country or destroy evidence. Federal agents were conducting raids and making arrests across the Southwest, gradually dismantling the entire network piece by piece. Jessica's cooperation with prosecutors would be essential to identifying all the participants and recovering as much stolen money as possible for the victims. I asked Detective Chen about the possibility of visiting Jessica in federal custody, not out of any desire for reconciliation, but to try to understand how my own sister had become capable of such calculated cruelty. Detective Chen advised against any contact, explaining that Jessica's attorneys would likely use any communication to claim that I was attempting to influence her testimony or interfere with the prosecution. The legal process would provide opportunities for victim impact statements and other forms of closure, but direct contact was inadvisable. The next few days passed in a blur of media interviews, legal consultations, and adjustments to life without electronic monitoring. Local news stations picked up the story of my exoneration and the fraud conspiracy, leading to a flood of calls from other potential victims who suspected they might have been framed by similar schemes. The Innocence Project was overwhelmed with requests for assistance, while federal prosecutors worked around the clock to process the evidence and build cases against all the conspirators. I ventured outside my immediate neighborhood for the first time in 6 months, taking a simple trip to the grocery store that felt like an adventure after so many months of confinement. The ability to walk down any aisle I wanted, spend as much time as I needed, and pay for my groceries without relying on someone else's assistance was a profound reminder of how much freedom I'd lost and regained. Other shoppers had no idea they were witnessing someone's first taste of liberty in half a year. Marcus helped me reconnect my personal computer to the internet after the federal cybercrime team had finished their examination and installed new security software. The first thing I did was research news coverage of the fraud conspiracy and Jessica's arrest, trying to understand how the story was being reported to the public. Most of the coverage was accurate and sympathetic to the victims, though some outlets focused more on the sensational aspects of family betrayal than on the systematic nature of the criminal enterprise. Attorney Rivera scheduled a meeting for the following week to begin preparing my formal exoneration petition and discuss the compensation process. The Innocence Project had successfully exonerated over 200 wrongfully convicted individuals in Arizona, and they understood exactly how to navigate the legal and bureaucratic challenges involved. My case was particularly strong because of the comprehensive digital evidence and the cooperation of federal investigators. The meeting with Attorney Rivera took place at the Innocence Project's offices, which seemed much brighter and more welcoming than they had during our first encounter. The staff treated me with warmth and respect, understanding that I was no longer just a potential client, but a confirmed victim of one of the most sophisticated fraud conspiracies they'd ever encountered. My case would likely become a template for identifying and exonerating other victims of similar schemes. We spent several hours reviewing the evidence that would be presented in my exoneration petition, including the digital forensics showing that my computer had been remotely accessed, the financial analysis proving that the offshore accounts had been opened using stolen identity information, and the testimony of other victims who had been framed by the same criminal organization. The case was so comprehensive that Attorney Rivera expected the petition to be granted within a matter of weeks rather than months. The compensation process would be more complex and time-consuming, involving detailed calculations of lost wages, legal expenses, and damages for wrongful imprisonment and psychological trauma. The state's wrongful conviction fund provided standardized compensation formulas, but my case also involved federal crimes that might qualify for additional restitution from the criminal defendants. Attorney Rivera estimated that my total compensation could exceed several $100,000, though the exact amount would depend on various legal and procedural factors. More important than the financial compensation was the prospect of having my criminal record completely expunged and my reputation restored. The wrongful conviction had followed me everywhere for 3 years, making it impossible to find employment, secure housing, or rebuild normal relationships. The exoneration would not only clear my name, but also serve as official acknowledgement that I had been the victim of sophisticated criminals rather than a perpetrator of financial fraud. Federal prosecutors contacted me later that week to discuss my role as a witness in the upcoming trials of Jessica, Tyler, and other members of the fraud network. My testimony would be crucial to establishing the conspiracy charges and demonstrating the lengths to which the criminals had gone to silence victims who threatened their operation. The prosecutors assured me that witness protection measures would be available if needed, though most of the network's leadership was now in custody. The conversation with federal prosecutors revealed additional disturbing details about the scope of Jessica and Tyler's activities. They had not only framed me for embezzlement, but had also been planning to target other women in my social and professional circles. My former colleagues at Morrison Financial Group had been researched and evaluated as potential victims, with detailed files compiled on their personal lives, financial situations, and vulnerabilities. The arrest of the conspiracy had probably prevented several additional innocent people from being destroyed. Jessica's cooperation with federal investigators was providing valuable intelligence about the fraud network's methods and targets, but it was also revealing the depth of her betrayal and manipulation. She had apparently begun planning my downfall, years before my arrest, systematically gathering personal information and identifying opportunities to exploit my position at Morrison Financial Group. The relationship I'd believed was genuine sisterly love had actually been a long-term criminal conspiracy. The hardest part of learning about Jessica's true nature was accepting that I'd never really known my own sister. The person who had comforted me after our parents' death, helped me through college, and supported me during difficult times had apparently been calculating and manipulating me from the beginning. Every shared memory was now contaminated by the knowledge that her affection had been performance rather than genuine emotion. Detective Chen arranged for me to speak with a victim services counselor who specialized in cases involving family, betrayal, and long-term manipulation. The psychological impact of discovering that a trusted family member had orchestrated such comprehensive destruction was comparable to surviving other forms of severe trauma. The counseling would be essential to helping me process the betrayal and develop healthy relationships in the future. The counseling sessions were difficult but necessary, providing a safe space to explore the complex emotions surrounding Jessica's betrayal and my own gradual realization that our relationship had been fundamentally dishonest. The counselor helped me understand that my failure to recognize Jessica's true nature wasn't a personal failing, but rather the natural result of being manipulated by someone with sophisticated psychological skills and years of access to build trust and gather information. Marcus continued to be a source of practical and emotional support throughout this period, helping me adjust to life without electronic monitoring while processing the revelations about Jessica and Tyler. His military background had given him experience with betrayal and deception in high-stakes situations, and his perspective was valuable in understanding how criminals could maintain false identities and manipulate trusted relationships over extended periods. The first time I drove a car after my exoneration was both liberating and terrifying. I'd maintained my driver's license during the house arrest period, but I hadn't been behind the wheel for 6 months. Marcus accompanied me on the first few trips, helping me regain confidence in basic activities that most people took for granted. The simple act of choosing where to go and when to leave represented a fundamental restoration of human dignity and autonomy. Morrison Financial Group contacted me through Attorney Rivera to discuss the possibility of returning to work. The company had conducted a thorough internal investigation and confirmed that I had been framed by external criminals who had compromised their computer systems. They were prepared to offer me reinstatement to my former position with full back pay, benefits, and a public acknowledgement of my innocence. The offer was generous and represented an important step toward rebuilding my professional reputation. The decision about whether to return to Morrison Financial Group was complicated by the psychological associations between the company and the trauma I'd experienced. Working in the same environment where I'd been framed for embezzlement would require confronting difficult memories and managing the stress of being surrounded by people who had once believed I was a criminal. The counselor helped me work through these concerns and develop strategies for managing the emotional challenges of returning to normal employment. Federal prosecutors informed me that Jessica's plea negotiations were proceeding rapidly, with her cooperation helping to build cases against the remaining members of the fraud network. She would likely receive a reduced sentence in exchange for her testimony, though she would still face significant prison time for her role in orchestrating multiple wrongful convictions. The prospect of my sister spending years in federal prison was painful despite everything she had done to me. The media coverage of my case had attracted attention from other potential victims of similar fraud schemes, leading to dozens of requests for assistance from people who suspected they might have been wrongfully convicted. The Innocence Project was working with federal investigators to identify patterns in these cases and determine which ones might be connected to the same criminal network. My exoneration was becoming a catalyst for exposing an even larger conspiracy of wrongful convictions. Attorney Rivera called with news that my formal exoneration petition had been approved by the Superior Court, officially overturning my conviction and clearing my criminal record. The judge had found that the newly discovered evidence of fraud and conspiracy clearly demonstrated my innocence and warranted immediate relief. The 3-year nightmare of wrongful conviction was finally over, and I was free to rebuild my life without the burden of a criminal record. The official exoneration document arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday morning that felt like Christmas and my birthday combined. The heavy cream paper bore the Superior Court's seal, and the formal language couldn't hide the magnitude of what it represented. After 3 years of carrying the weight of a felony conviction, I was officially innocent. In the eyes of the law, Attorney Rivera had warned me that receiving the document would be emotional, but I wasn't prepared for the flood of relief, vindication, and grief that washed over me as I read the judge's findings. The court's language was clear and unambiguous. The evidence presented by the Innocence Project demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that I had been the victim of an elaborate criminal conspiracy designed to frame me for crimes I had not committed. The original prosecution had been based on fabricated evidence created by sophisticated criminals who had systematically stolen my identity and manipulated financial records to support their false accusations. My conviction was hereby vacated, my criminal record expunged, and my civil rights fully restored. I called Marcus immediately to share the news, and his excitement was genuine and infectious. He'd witnessed my struggles firsthand and understood better than anyone how much this vindication meant to me. We celebrated with coffee and donuts from the bakery down the street, a simple pleasure that felt extraordinary after years of isolation and shame. Marcus raised his cup in a toast to justice finally being served, and I felt tears of happiness mixing with the sweetness of the glazed donut. The next phone call was to my victim services counselor, who had been preparing me for this moment and helping me develop strategies for managing the complex emotions that would accompany my exoneration. She reminded me that vindication often brought unexpected feelings of anger and loss alongside the obvious relief and joy. I would need time to process not just the restoration of my innocence, but also the years that had been stolen from me, and the relationships that had been destroyed by Jessica's betrayal. Detective Chen called that afternoon with updates about the ongoing federal investigation and prosecutions. The evidence gathered from Jessica and Tyler's computers had led to the identification of 17 additional victims across 6 states, all young women working in financial services who had been framed for embezzlement by the same criminal network. Federal prosecutors were working with local authorities to review each case and begin the process of overturning wrongful convictions that had destroyed innocent lives. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The fraud network had operated like a sophisticated business, with different teams responsible for target identification, intelligence gathering, evidence fabrication, and money laundering. Jessica and Tyler had been part of the intelligence gathering operation, using personal relationships and social engineering to collect the information needed to frame their victims. Other teams had specialized in hacking financial systems, creating fake documentation, and moving stolen funds through complex networks of offshore accounts. What made the conspiracy particularly insidious was its targeting of vulnerable individuals, who were unlikely to have the resources needed to mount effective legal defenses. Young women working entry-level positions in financial services were perfect victims because they had access to systems that could be compromised but lacked the money, connections, or experience needed to challenge sophisticated frame-ups. The criminals had counted on their victims accepting plea bargains rather than fighting charges they couldn't afford to contest. Federal investigators had also uncovered evidence that the fraud network had connections to corrupt officials within local law enforcement and the criminal justice system. Some prosecutors and judges had received payments or other benefits in exchange for ensuring that targeted individuals were convicted regardless of the strength of the evidence against them. The corruption investigation was expanding rapidly as agents followed the money trail and identified officials who had been compromised by the criminal organization. Attorney Rivera scheduled a meeting to discuss the compensation process and help me understand the various forms of restitution that might be available. The state's wrongful conviction compensation fund provided standardized payments based on the length of imprisonment and other factors, but my case also involved federal crimes that qualified for additional restitution from the criminal defendants. The total compensation could be substantial, though the exact amount would depend on complex legal calculations and the defendant's ability to pay. The compensation process was more complicated than I'd expected, involving multiple agencies and legal procedures that would take months to complete. The state fund required extensive documentation of lost wages, legal expenses, and other damages resulting from the wrongful conviction. Federal restitution proceedings would require separate filings and court appearances, with payments dependent on the assets seized from the criminal defendants. Attorney Rivera assured me that the Innocence Project would handle all the paperwork and legal requirements, but I would need to provide detailed information about my financial losses and ongoing expenses. More important than the financial compensation was the psychological impact of having my innocence officially recognized. The wrongful conviction had affected every aspect of my life, from employment opportunities to personal relationships to my fundamental sense of self-worth. Friends and family members who had believed the prosecution's case would now have to confront the reality that I had been telling the truth all along. Some relationships might be salvageable, but others had been permanently damaged by years of suspicion and doubt. Morrison Financial Group contacted me through their legal department to formalize their offer of reinstatement and compensation for the damages I had suffered as a result of their security failures. The company had conducted an extensive internal investigation and concluded that their computer systems had been compromised by the same criminals who had framed me. They were prepared to offer full reinstatement to my former position, 3 years of back pay with interest, full benefits retroactive to the date of my termination, and a substantial settlement payment in exchange for agreeing not to pursue additional litigation. The decision about whether to return to Morrison Financial Group required careful consideration of both practical and emotional factors. The financial package they were offering would provide immediate stability and help me rebuild my life, but working in the same environment where I'd been framed might be psychologically difficult. My counselor helped me explore my feelings about returning to the scene of the trauma and develop strategies for managing any emotional challenges that might arise. I decided to accept Morrison's offer, partly for the financial security it provided, but mostly because I wanted to reclaim the professional identity that had been stolen from me. The criminals had tried to destroy my career and reputation, and returning to work in my chosen field felt like the ultimate vindication. I would be working alongside some of the same people who had once believed I was guilty, but I was prepared to face those challenges with the support of my legal team and counselor. The day I returned to Morrison Financial Group was surreal and emotional. The office looked exactly the same as it had 3 years earlier, but everything felt different now that I understood how the security systems had been compromised and my identity stolen. My former colleagues were professional and welcoming, though I could sense their discomfort with the situation and their own guilt about having believed the accusations against me. The company had issued a statement acknowledging my innocence and apologizing for the security failures that had enabled the fraud. My new supervisor, Sandra Walsh, had been brought in from another branch specifically to help manage my transition back to work. She understood the unique challenges of my situation and worked with me to develop a modified schedule that would allow me to adjust gradually to full-time employment. The company also provided access to counseling services and other support resources to help me manage any work-related stress or anxiety that might arise from being back in the environment where the trauma had occurred. The work itself was familiar and comforting, providing a sense of normalcy and purpose that I'd been missing during the years of legal battles and house arrest. Financial analysis and reporting required concentration and attention to detail that helped distract me from dwelling on the past or worrying about the ongoing federal prosecutions. My colleagues gradually relaxed around me as they realized that I was the same competent professional I'd always been, just someone who had survived an extraordinary ordeal. Federal prosecutors informed me that Jessica's trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks, with my testimony expected to be a crucial element of their case against her and the broader criminal conspiracy. Testifying against my own sister would be one of the most difficult things I'd ever done, but it was necessary to ensure that justice was served and to prevent other innocent people from suffering similar fates. The prosecutors assured me that victim services personnel would be available to provide support throughout the trial process. Preparing for testimony required multiple meetings with federal prosecutors to review the evidence and anticipate the defense team's likely strategies. Jessica's attorneys would probably argue that she had been manipulated by Tyler and other members of the conspiracy, portraying her as another victim rather than an active participant in the fraud scheme. My testimony would be essential to establishing that she had been a willing and knowing participant who had systematically betrayed my trust over a period of years. The prosecutors showed me additional evidence that had been recovered from Jessica's personal files, including detailed psychological profiles she had compiled about me and other potential victims. The documents revealed a level of calculated manipulation that was shocking even given everything I already knew about her betrayal. She had analyzed my personality, relationships, and vulnerabilities with the clinical detachment of a predator studying prey, identifying exactly how to exploit my trust and gather the information needed to destroy my life. One particularly disturbing document was titled Operational Assessment, Margaret Young, and contained a comprehensive analysis of my character, habits, and potential weaknesses. Jessica had noted my tendency to trust family members implicitly, my reluctance to question authority figures, and my limited knowledge of legal procedures. She had identified these traits as advantages that could be exploited to ensure that I would be unlikely to mount an effective defense against false accusations. The document also revealed that Jessica had been considering me as a potential target. For over 2 years before the actual frame-up occurred, she had systematically gathered information about my job responsibilities, computer access, and financial activities while maintaining the facade of a supportive sister. Every conversation we'd had about my work at Morrison Financial Group had been intelligence gathering for the criminal conspiracy, with Jessica carefully probing for details that could later be used against me. Reading Jessica's clinical analysis of my personality and vulnerabilities was devastating in a way that even her betrayal hadn't been. It forced me to confront the reality that our entire relationship had been fundamentally dishonest, with her treating me as a mark to be exploited rather than a sister to be loved. The counselor helped me understand that this level of manipulation was characteristic of sophisticated criminal operations and didn't reflect any personal failing on my part. Marcus provided crucial emotional support during this period, offering practical help with daily tasks while I processed the psychological impact of preparing for Jessica's trial. His steady presence and genuine friendship served as a reminder that authentic relationships were possible even after experiencing such profound betrayal. He helped me maintain perspective by focusing on the positive developments in my life, including my successful return to work and the progress of the federal investigation. The victim services counselor recommended that I consider joining a support group for people who had experienced betrayal by family members. The group met weekly at a community center downtown and included individuals who had survived various forms of familial abuse, fraud, and manipulation. Sharing my story with others who understood the unique pain of family betrayal was therapeutic and helped me realize that I wasn't alone in struggling to rebuild trust and relationships after such trauma. The support group included other victims of financial fraud, though none had experienced anything as sophisticated as the conspiracy that had targeted me. Their stories reminded me that families could be sources of harm as well as support, and that survival often required setting boundaries with people who claimed to love us while actively working to destroy our lives. The group provided a safe space to explore the complex emotions surrounding Jessica's betrayal without judgment or pressure to forgive or reconcile. Detective Chen contacted me with news that federal agents had arrested 3 additional members of the fraud network who had been operating in other states. The investigation was revealing connections to similar conspiracies across the country, suggesting that the problem of organized wrongful convictions was even larger than initially suspected. My case was becoming a template for identifying and prosecuting these sophisticated criminal operations, with other law enforcement agencies using similar investigative techniques to uncover fraud networks in their jurisdictions. The arrests were generating significant media attention and public interest in the issue of wrongful convictions caused by organized criminal conspiracies. Several national news programs had contacted the Innocence Project requesting interviews about my case and its implications for criminal justice reform. Attorney Rivera recommended that I consider participating in some media interviews to help raise awareness about the problem and encourage other potential victims to come forward. I decided to participate in a limited number of carefully selected media interviews, focusing on reputable news organizations that were committed to accurate reporting rather than sensationalism. The interviews provided an opportunity to share my story with a broader audience and help other victims understand that they weren't alone in their experiences. Many of the journalists I spoke with were surprised by the sophistication of the fraud network and the systematic nature of the targeting. The media coverage generated dozens of calls from people who suspected they might have been victims of similar fraud schemes. The Innocence Project was overwhelmed with requests for assistance, while federal prosecutors worked to identify which cases might be connected to organized conspiracies rather than individual criminal acts. My story was serving as a catalyst for a broader examination of how criminal organizations could exploit weaknesses in the justice system to frame innocent people. One of the most rewarding aspects of the media coverage was hearing from other exonerees who had been freed from wrongful convictions through the work of organizations like the Innocence Project. Their messages of support and encouragement reminded me that survival and healing were possible, even after experiencing devastating injustice. Many of them had gone on to become advocates for criminal justice reform, using their experiences to help prevent other innocent people from suffering similar fates. The financial compensation from both the state wrongful conviction fund and federal restitution proceedings was beginning to materialize, providing the resources I needed to rebuild my life and plan for the future. The money couldn't restore the years that had been stolen from me or repair all the relationships that had been damaged, but it provided security and options that had been unavailable during the years of struggle and uncertainty. Attorney Rivera helped me establish a financial plan that would ensure the compensation money was invested wisely and used to support long-term goals rather than just immediate needs. Part of the funds would be dedicated to continuing education and professional development, allowing me to advance my career and build expertise that would be valuable in the evolving field of financial security. Another portion would be set aside for supporting other wrongful conviction cases and criminal justice reform efforts. The prospect of using my experience to help other victims was both inspiring and daunting. I wasn't sure I was ready to become a public advocate or take on the emotional burden of working with other people who had survived similar trauma. The counselor helped me explore these feelings and develop realistic expectations about what kind of advocacy work might be sustainable and fulfilling rather than overwhelming. Federal prosecutors informed me that Jessica had agreed to a plea bargain that would require her to serve 12 years in federal prison in exchange for her cooperation with ongoing investigations. The sentence was substantial, but less than the maximum she could have received if the case had gone to trial. Her cooperation was helping investigators identify and prosecute other members of the fraud network, potentially preventing additional innocent people from being victimized. The news of Jessica's plea agreement brought mixed emotions. Part of me was relieved that I wouldn't have to testify against her in a lengthy trial, while another part felt that the sentence wasn't adequate given the scope of her crimes and the number of lives she had helped destroy. The counselor reminded me that justice wasn't always about punishment, but also about preventing future harm and helping victims rebuild their lives. I wrote a victim impact statement that would be read during Jessica's sentencing hearing, describing the profound damage her betrayal had caused to my life, relationships, and sense of trust. The statement was difficult to write but therapeutic in its own way, providing an opportunity to articulate the full scope of the harm that had been done and to reclaim my voice in a process that had often left me feeling powerless and silenced. The victim impact statement also addressed the broader implications of Jessica's crimes beyond their personal impact on me. Her actions had contributed to a systematic assault on the integrity of the criminal justice system, undermining public trust in law enforcement and the courts. The fraud network had perverted the very institutions that were supposed to protect innocent people, turning them into weapons against the victims they were meant to serve. Morrison Financial Group implemented new security protocols based on the lessons learned from the fraud conspiracy that had targeted me and other employees. The company invested in advanced cybersecurity systems, enhanced employee training programs, and improved procedures for detecting and responding to potential security breaches. My experience with the fraud network was incorporated into training materials to help other employees recognize signs of potential targeting and social engineering attempts. The company also established a victim support fund to provide assistance to employees who might be targeted by similar schemes in the future. The fund would cover legal expenses, counseling services, and other support resources needed to help victims navigate the criminal justice system and rebuild their lives. My case had demonstrated how quickly a targeted individual could lose everything: and the company was committed to ensuring that future victims would have access to the resources needed to mount effective defenses. Working at Morrison Financial Group provided a sense of normalcy and purpose, but it also served as a daily reminder of how my life had been derailed by criminal conspiracy. The office where I'd once been arrested was just down the hall from my new workspace, and I passed it every day on my way to meetings and breaks. The counselor helped me develop strategies for managing these environmental triggers and processing the emotions they evoked. My colleagues at Morrison gradually became more comfortable discussing my case and the broader implications of the fraud network. Many of them expressed guilt about having believed the accusations against me, while others shared their own fears about becoming targets of similar schemes. These conversations helped normalize the experience of being victimized by sophisticated criminals and reduce the isolation and shame that often accompany wrongful accusations. The federal investigation was expanding to include other financial services companies that had been infiltrated by members of the fraud network. Investigators were discovering that the conspiracy had been even more extensive than initially realized, with criminal operatives placed in strategic positions throughout the industry. The investigation was revealing a level of organized criminal activity that challenged assumptions about how fraud schemes operated and how they could be detected and prevented. Detective Chen informed me that federal agents had recovered over $15 million in stolen funds that would be distributed among the various victims of the fraud network. The recovery process would be complex and time-consuming, but it represented a significant victory for the victims and a substantial blow to the criminal organization. The seized assets included real estate, luxury vehicles, jewelry, and investment accounts that had been purchased with money stolen from the victims. The asset recovery process required extensive documentation and legal proceedings to establish each victim's claim to a portion of the seized funds. Attorney Rivera worked with federal prosecutors to ensure that my claim was properly documented and that I would receive appropriate compensation for the financial losses I had suffered. The process would take months to complete, but the eventual payout would provide additional resources for rebuilding my life and supporting criminal justice reform efforts. One of the most gratifying aspects of the federal investigation was learning that my decision to fight the false accusations had prevented other innocent people from being victimized. Jessica and Tyler's arrest had disrupted their plans to target additional employees at Morrison Financial Group and other companies in the area. Federal agents had found detailed files on potential future victims, including personal information and vulnerability assessments that would have been used to frame them for crimes they hadn't committed. The knowledge that my struggle had protected other innocent people from suffering similar fates provided meaning and purpose to an experience that had otherwise been purely destructive. The counselor helped me understand that survival itself could be a form of resistance against criminal organizations that counted on their victims being too isolated, ashamed, or powerless to fight back effectively. My refusal to accept the false accusations had ultimately led to the exposure and prosecution of an entire criminal network. Marcus and I celebrated the one-year anniversary of my ankle monitor removal with dinner at a restaurant I'd only dreamed of visiting during the months of house arrest. The simple act of choosing where to eat, when to arrive, and how long to stay represented freedoms that most people took for granted, but that I would never again fail to appreciate. The evening was a reminder of how much my life had changed, and how much healing had occurred in the year since my exoneration. The anniversary also provided an opportunity to reflect on the lessons I'd learned about resilience, justice, and the importance of refusing to surrender even when facing overwhelming odds. The experience had taught me that truth and persistence could ultimately prevail against even sophisticated criminal conspiracies, though the process required tremendous patience, courage, and support from others. I'd discovered reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed, and developed relationships that would sustain me for years to come. 2 years after my exoneration, I stood before a congressional subcommittee on criminal justice reform, holding the same ankle monitor that had once imprisoned me in my duplex. The device that had tracked my every movement for 6 months was now serving as evidence in hearings about how electronic monitoring data could prevent wrongful convictions. The irony wasn't lost on me that the technology designed to restrict my freedom had ultimately proven my innocence and exposed a criminal conspiracy that might otherwise have continued destroying innocent lives. The congressional testimony was part of a broader effort to reform how electronic monitoring systems were used in the criminal justice system. My case had demonstrated that the data collected by these devices could be powerful evidence of innocence when properly analyzed and presented, but it had also revealed how easily the system could be manipulated by corrupt officials who ignored contradictory evidence. The subcommittee was considering legislation that would require independent review of monitoring data in cases where parole violations were alleged. Representative Martinez, who chaired the subcommittee, asked me to describe the psychological impact of being falsely accused while under electronic surveillance. I explained how the ankle monitor had felt like a symbol of guilt and shame, even though I knew I was innocent. The device had been both my captor and my salvation, restricting my movements while simultaneously creating the digital trail that would eventually prove my innocence. The duality of that experience had taught me valuable lessons about how technology could be used to both oppress and liberate. The hearing room was packed with advocates, attorneys, and other wrongfully convicted individuals who had traveled to Washington to support the reform legislation. Many of them had experienced similar betrayals by family members or trusted associates, though few had faced anything as sophisticated as the conspiracy that had targeted me. Their presence reminded me that I wasn't alone in my experience and that my story was part of a larger movement toward justice and accountability. Following my congressional testimony, I was contacted by several universities that wanted to incorporate my case into their criminal justice and cybersecurity curricula. The fraud network that had targeted me represented a new category of organized crime that exploited weaknesses in both technological systems and human relationships. Academic researchers were studying the case to understand how such conspiracies operated and how they could be detected and prevented in the future. Professor David Kim from Arizona State University invited me to serve as a guest lecturer in his corporate fraud investigation course. Speaking to criminal justice students about my experience was both challenging and rewarding, providing an opportunity to help the next generation of investigators understand the sophisticated techniques used by modern criminal organizations. Many of the students were shocked by the level of planning and coordination that had gone into framing me, having assumed that most fraud cases involved individual actors rather than organized networks. The lectures also served as a form of therapy, allowing me to transform my traumatic experience into something educational and potentially beneficial for others. The students' questions forced me to think deeply about the psychological and social factors that had made me vulnerable to targeting, while their enthusiasm for justice reminded me why my story was worth sharing despite the personal pain it involved. Morrison Financial Group promoted me to senior analyst and asked me to lead a new initiative focused on identifying and preventing the type of internal security breaches that had enabled the fraud conspiracy. The position allowed me to use my first-hand experience with sophisticated criminal targeting to help protect other employees and clients from similar schemes. The work was meaningful and fulfilling, providing a sense of purpose that had been missing during the years of legal battles and recovery. The security initiative involved developing new protocols for monitoring employee behavior patterns, detecting unusual network access, and responding to potential social engineering attempts. My experience with Jessica's manipulation tactics was invaluable in creating training materials that helped employees recognize and resist attempts to gather sensitive information through personal relationships. The program was eventually adopted by other financial services companies throughout the region. Jessica's sentencing hearing took place on a cold morning in federal court, with victims from across the country traveling to provide impact statements about how the fraud network had destroyed their lives. I sat in the gallery watching my sister, in her orange jumpsuit, trying to reconcile the person I thought I'd known with the calculating criminal who had systematically betrayed my trust for years. She looked smaller and older than I remembered, but her expression remained cold and distant throughout the proceedings. When given the opportunity to address the court, Jessica offered what seemed like a scripted apology that focused more on her own circumstances than on the harm she had caused to her victims. She claimed to have been manipulated by Tyler and other members of the conspiracy, portraying herself as someone who had gotten in over her head rather than acknowledging her role as an active and willing participant in the fraud scheme. Her words felt empty and calculated, lacking any genuine remorse or understanding of the devastation she had caused. The judge sentenced Jessica to 15 years in federal prison, 3 years more than the plea agreement had specified, citing the sophistication of the conspiracy and the number of victims who had been harmed. He noted that the fraud network had represented a systematic assault on the integrity of the criminal justice system and that deterrent sentences were necessary to prevent similar conspiracies in the future. Jessica showed no visible emotion as the sentence was announced, maintaining the same cold detachment she had displayed throughout the proceedings. Tyler received a 20-year sentence for his role as one of the conspiracy's leaders, while other members of the network received sentences ranging from 5 to 18 years depending on their level of involvement. Federal prosecutors estimated that the conspiracy had generated over $30 million in illegal profits while destroying the lives of dozens of innocent victims. The sentences represented a significant victory for the victims and a strong deterrent message to other potential criminal organizations. The asset forfeiture proceedings resulted in a substantial financial recovery for the victims, with my share totaling over $400,000, in addition to the compensation I had already received from the state and Morrison Financial Group. The money provided security and options for the future, but more importantly, it represented official acknowledgement of the harm that had been done and society's commitment to making victims whole to the extent possible. I used part of the settlement money to establish a foundation focused on supporting wrongfully convicted individuals and their families during the exoneration process. The foundation provided emergency financial assistance, legal resources, and counseling services to help victims navigate the complex challenges of rebuilding their lives after wrongful conviction. The foundation also funded research into the causes of wrongful convictions and supported legislative reforms designed to prevent similar injustices. Marcus became the foundation's first full-time employee, using his construction background to help exonerees with practical tasks like finding housing, securing employment, and rebuilding their credit after years of incarceration or legal troubles. His genuine empathy and practical approach made him invaluable in helping people transition from the isolation of wrongful conviction to the challenge of rebuilding normal lives. Our friendship had evolved into a meaningful partnership focused on helping others survive experiences similar to what I had endured. The Foundation's work brought me into contact with dozens of other wrongfully convicted individuals, each with their own story of betrayal, injustice, and eventual vindication. Many had experienced family betrayal similar to mine, while others had been framed by corrupt officials, incompetent attorneys, or systemic failures in the criminal justice process. Despite the differences in their cases, they all shared the common experience of having their fundamental trust in fairness and justice shattered by wrongful conviction. Working with other exonerees was both inspiring and emotionally challenging. Their resilience and determination reminded me of the strength that people could find even in the darkest circumstances, while their ongoing struggles highlighted how difficult it could be to fully recover from wrongful conviction. Many faced continuing challenges with employment, relationships, and mental health years after their exonerations, demonstrating that vindication was just the beginning of a long healing process. Detective Chen was promoted to captain and asked to head a new task force focused on identifying and dismantling organized fraud conspiracies. The task force used techniques developed during the investigation of my case to identify other criminal networks that were systematically framing innocent people for financial crimes. Their work led to the discovery of similar conspiracies in 12 other states, ultimately resulting in over 200 exonerations and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen assets. The success of Detective Chen's task force demonstrated that the conspiracy that had targeted me was part of a much larger problem that required coordinated law enforcement response. Criminal organizations had learned to exploit weaknesses in the justice system, using sophisticated techniques to frame innocent people while covering their own tracks. The task force's work was helping to level the playing field by giving law enforcement the tools and knowledge needed to identify and combat these sophisticated criminal operations. 3 years after my exoneration, I married David Rodriguez, a civil rights attorney I had met through the Foundation's work. David understood the unique challenges faced by wrongful conviction survivors and provided the emotional support and legal expertise that helped me continue healing and growing. Our relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection rather than the manipulation and deception that had characterized my relationship with Jessica. Planning our wedding required confronting the reality that Jessica would not be there to serve as my maid of honor, a role I had always assumed she would fill despite our complicated relationship. The absence of my family of origin was painful, but it was balanced by the presence of friends and colleagues who had supported me through the darkest period of my life. Marcus walked me down the aisle, symbolizing how chosen family could be more meaningful and supportive than biological relationships. The wedding reception included many of the people who had helped me survive and rebuild after wrongful conviction, including Attorney Rivera, Detective Chen, my counselor, and several other exonerees who had become close friends. The celebration was a testament to the power of authentic relationships and community support in overcoming even the most devastating betrayals and injustices. It represented not just the beginning of a new marriage, but the culmination of a long journey from victim to survivor to advocate. David and I honeymooned in Ireland, my first international travel since before my arrest. The trip represented a level of freedom and possibility that had seemed impossible during the years of house arrest and legal battles. Standing on the cliffs of Moher, watching the Atlantic waves crash against the rocks below, I reflected on how far I had traveled from the small duplex where I had once been confined by an ankle monitor and false accusations. The Foundation continued to grow and expand its services, eventually helping over 300 wrongfully convicted individuals and their families. We developed partnerships with law schools, forensic laboratories, and other organizations committed to preventing wrongful convictions and supporting exonerees. The Foundation's work was featured in documentaries, academic studies, and legislative hearings, helping to raise awareness about the ongoing problem of wrongful convictions and the need for systematic reforms. My story was eventually published as a book titled "Monitored: How Electronic Evidence Saved My Life and Exposed a Criminal Conspiracy." The book became a bestseller and was optioned for a television miniseries, providing additional resources for the Foundation's work while helping to educate the public about the realities of wrongful conviction and the sophisticated techniques used by modern criminal organizations. The book tour took me to cities across the country, where I spoke to audiences about the importance of skepticism, the value of digital evidence, and the need for reforms in the criminal justice system. Many readers were shocked by the sophistication of the conspiracy that had targeted me, having assumed that most wrongful convictions resulted from simple mistakes rather than deliberate criminal schemes. The book helped change public perception about the causes of wrongful convictions and the resources needed to prevent them. 5 years after my exoneration, I testified before the United Nations Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice about the emerging threat of organized wrongful conviction conspiracies. My case had become an international example of how criminal organizations could exploit weaknesses in justice systems around the world, and my testimony helped inform global efforts to identify and combat these sophisticated criminal schemes. The international recognition was gratifying, but it also highlighted the global scope of the problem and the need for coordinated responses across national boundaries. Criminal organizations were increasingly operating across jurisdictions, using technology and financial networks that transcended traditional law enforcement boundaries. My case had become a template for understanding and combating these evolving Threats to justice and fairness. Today, I serve as executive director of the foundation while continuing my work at Morrison Financial Group. The dual roles allow me to apply my professional expertise to preventing financial crimes while using my personal experience to support wrongful conviction survivors. The combination is challenging but fulfilling, providing multiple avenues for making a positive impact on issues that matter deeply to me. Jessica remains in federal prison, with her earliest possible release date still 8 years away. I haven't visited or communicated with her since her sentencing, a decision that my counselor and David both support as necessary for my continued healing and well-being. The counselor helped me understand that forgiveness doesn't require maintaining relationships with people who have caused profound harm, and that protecting my own mental health was more important than preserving family connections. Marcus still lives in the other half of our old duplex, though he now owns the entire building and has converted my former unit into an office for the foundation. We kept the space where the ankle monitor base unit had once stood as a reminder of how far we'd both traveled since those dark days of house arrest and false accusations. The foundation's first office, being located in the place where my nightmare began, feels like a form of poetic justice. The ankle monitor that had once confined me to that small space now sits in a display case in the foundation's lobby, along with a plaque describing how electronic evidence had exposed a criminal conspiracy and prevented additional wrongful convictions. Visitors often comment on the irony that a device designed to restrict freedom had ultimately proved liberating, serving as a reminder that truth and justice can emerge from the most unlikely sources. Looking back on the experience, I'm struck by how a single false accusation had led to the exposure of a criminal network that had destroyed dozens of innocent lives. My refusal to accept the lies about my character and conduct had ultimately protected other potential victims and brought justice to people who had suffered similar fates. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate had been long and difficult, but it had also been transformative in ways I could never have imagined. The story that began with an ankle monitor and false accusations had evolved into something much larger and more meaningful than I could have anticipated. What started as a personal nightmare had become a vehicle for positive change, helping to reform systems, support survivors, and prevent future injustices. The experience had taught me that even the most devastating betrayals could be transformed into sources of strength, purpose, and hope for others facing similar challenges. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.